Our next presenter, next teacher, next scholar, is a brilliant young man whom I've known, it's my pleasure to have known for a few years now, Matthias Becker. Matthias is one of the ISGAP postdoctoral fellows at Cambridge. He also has, based in Berlin, Herzliya. He heads up what's called the Decoding Project, Decoding Antisemitism. He works in a very urgent and pressing and important area, social media, something that even the youngsters among us could learn more about. I certainly have a lot to learn about how it works, what makes it run, and the complexities, the vast complexities of tracking, searching, decoding anti-Semitism in social media. So please welcome Matthias Becker, Dr. Becker.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very warm introduction. So, a few additional details about where I'm coming from. So my background is linguistics, applied cognitive linguistics, and social media studies, and I've been doing this kind of work for around 12 years, really studying hate speech more broadly, and then diving deeper into anti-Semitism, specifically on social media platforms. And the whole approach is based on this understanding that you can look into language as a door to the mind. That you can actually do data analysis of written text or multimodal text, and you get a proper understanding of what's happening in the group or in a national discourse you are interested in. That's more or less the idea. That started much earlier in history, and of course we all know Foucault, we know critical discourse analysis, Ruth Wodak, and all these scholars in the field. And maybe also an interesting read would be George Lakoff and his books about metaphors and how metaphors shape our understanding of political questions. He did an interesting study about how metaphors have been used by the Democrats and the Republicans after 9/11. That's very insightful to read it, because it's, metaphors, due to the fact that they combine two conceptual arenas and they build something, they add something to it, and it's very often a rather emotional picture that is activated. It can shape the mindset of many, many people. And it's very often working unconsciously. So that's something I'm really interested in, and in my work I haven't really been focusing on fringe discourse, on right-wing extremist or Islamist discourse, because I thought when it comes to anti-Semitism, and you can see anti-Semitism in all different levels of society and different discourses, it's really interesting, especially from a linguistic point of view, how people express those ideas in politically moderate contexts. So people who would say about themselves, I cannot be an anti-Semite, I'm not a bigot, I'm not a racist, but still you find anti-Semitism in those spheres, in those discourses, but very often expressed in subtle ways. And I wanted to build, work on a taxonomy of how to measure this, highly inspired by other anti-Semitism researchers, of course, and I just wanted to move that a little bit further. And so in my presentation, I will, of course, talk about October 7th and the responses we can see online. Before that, I will just talk a little bit about the challenges we have to face when we talk about online discourse and how to measure political discourse online, because that's not so easy as it seems. And then, of course, the whole approach we follow in the Decoding Antisemitism project. And I think the first time I came here was in 2017 or 18, and back then I was already talking to Charles about the necessity of dealing with social media, because it has such a gigantic impact on our societies. I mean, of course, it goes without saying, academic discourse, classrooms, what's happening on campus, at university classes, that's all really relevant. But I would argue that a lot of debate is actually happening on social media. The discourse is moved forward, is specified. It's you can actually track narratives that are out there if you just look at socially relevant online spheres. If you understand what's happening there, you get a pretty good understanding of what will come next or what becomes like the new norm in the target group you're interested in. And so I'm very happy that I'm allowed to give some input here. Let me see if that works. Yeah, so, and it's obvious that when we talk about the relevance, or if you talk about anti-Semitism and where it comes from, I think we have a good approach if we understand the dynamics on social media as the primary venue for political debate and information acquisition, because this is just where things happen. And if we want to understand how young generations, future generations, what they think about the Jewish outgroup, what they think about the Mideast conflict, about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, if our work, our methodology is sound, and we have an opportunity to make online discourse transparent, we get a pretty good understanding of where the society discourse is heading. And that's what I would argue for, that we really take that part seriously, because it will affect future generations. And if we want to do something about anti-Semitism on different levels, in research, in education, advocacy, we do a good job in understanding it in the first place. Because very often I think a lot of strategies don't work properly because they have a predefined understanding of Jew hatred, coming very often from history or political science, or we just look at certain radicalized groups, and their argumentation is often very basic. But when you actually look into online discourse, you see that the way how these ideas are circulating is very often far more sophisticated. And it's important to track that in order to build powerful counter-narratives, counter-strategies, offline and online. And I was diving into this topic in this article that was published a month ago, I think, where I summarized the potential of social media studies in order to understand, one, and two, tackle anti-Semitism. Like if we actually have, again, if we have a sound methodology, if we bring in like a mixed methods approach, I think we have good opportunities to deal with those issues because, again, in order to fight some kind of disease, if you allow that kind of metaphor, you need to understand how the virus works and what's actually happening. What are the current building blocks of a hate ideology? So I would say that in the 90s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, early 2000s, if you were interested in anti-Semitism, you had some issues understanding how the discourse looks like, because many things happened offline in detached discourses at the pub, in private sectors, and you weren't really able to assess that. There were surveys. Surveys always have lots of methodological issues. There are priming effects. There's the concept of social desirability. It's a very artificial situation where you can answer certain questions in a rather predefined form. And so there are lots of issues, and then you had interview studies, all quite explorative. You have a lot of explorative social media studies. But when you just see how discourse, for instance, after October 7th, or after Kanye West's statements, or Elon Musk's decisions, how the discourse evolves online, you have the opportunity to look at the way people think about the ADL, or about Jewish communities, or about Israel, by self-motivated statements. So it's not artificial, it's not limited, and you get a really good understanding of what are the first associations that are activated by a discourse event. And so I think on the one hand, we are really dealing with an incredible, unprecedented surge in anti-Semitism, which is scary, which is a big challenge, particularly for Western societies. And at the same time, we have an incredible opportunity here. If we use social media studies in a way that takes into account all the different levels of anti-Semitism, of hate speech in general, whatever you're interested in. It can also be like forms of racism or misogyny. But if you use those data, because the public discourse is really moving towards social media, and lots of ideas and debates are laid out and accessible if you have the right tools, and the second step, if you have the right methodology, that you can take a lot from those kinds of studies. But of course, the precondition for that is that you have a nice mix of humanities and social sciences and data science, that you actually bring expertise together from different strands so that your understanding of the problem you would like to examine is comprehensive. Because I would argue that many studies on hate speech online have a rather limited definition of hate speech, or they are not well versed when it comes to the technological implementation. So there's very often an element missing. And that's why I would argue if you have a comprehensive approach, this will help a lot in order to tackle current and future challenges. But of course, when we talk about anti-Semitism online, there are lots of hurdles, there are lots of challenges that we need to take into account. On the one hand, I mean, we had a lot of sessions about anti-Semitism and how complex the topic is, a 2,000-year-old hate ideology, shape-shifting part of discourse on the right, on the left, and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't dive into this too much because you are pretty aware of that. By the way, sometimes you see a QR code on the right side. Since we don't have much time, not now, but later, if you're interested in something, just scan it, and we can talk about this later, but there's just sometimes a reference that you can use. So on the content level, it's already challenging, right? So anti-Semitism is a complex phenomenon, has lots of building blocks or stereotypes, concepts, as I call it, concepts based around stereotypes, conspiracy myths, analogies, speech acts. They are all kind of part of that hate ideology. And then, of course, as a second challenge, you have the communication space itself. In contrast to the 80s and 90s, if you wanted to understand what's happening in a political party, you just looked at the declarations of that party, and you get a pretty good understanding of what's going on in that. Because these are the narratives coming from the top of that particular group, and it's like you have these top-down processes, whereas in online discourse, you of course have a lot of bottom-up processes. There are lots of cooks, there are lots of ideas that are coming together, lots of platforms that have their own way of interaction or triggering certain forms of interaction. And of course, there are communication conditions online that we never had in the offline world. So you have anonymity, you have the mutual confirmation of hate speech, like people feel emboldened in expressing anti-Semitic ideas or racist ideas online because they are just not visible. They are just not the same mechanisms, controlling mechanisms that you have when you go out with friends and someone says something anti-Semitic, where you might have sanctions in the second place. But this is something that, of course, has an effect on the way of how society discourse is happening in the midst of a huge online space where you didn't have any regulations for many years by now. And I mean, there was so much research and so much advocacy already 10 years ago about the negative implications coming from online discourse. What this will happen to democratic discourse, what it happens to our belief systems, how much we trust certain institutions. And it's not only about hate speech, it's just there's a radical normalization of hate speech and distorted ideas that we have to take into account, and they haven't been really taken into account for quite some time. And of course, the third challenge would be communication itself. Sorry, I probably talked too long about these points, but it's, communication, of course, this is my expertise. Of course, we are social beings. We talk about different topics, particularly if it comes to political topics, implicitly, in subtle ways. We use concepts of politeness. We just very often don't say what we think, word by word. This is just how human interaction works. And this holds true even more when we talk about a tabooed hate ideology, right? So as soon as you know, when you grow up in Germany or in France, and you know anti-Semitism historically was a big issue, you don't want to be called an anti-Semite, you just use different ways of communicating that point, because deep in your heart you still have that idea. Or maybe you're not even conscious about it. You just express it, that you think something is going on in the German government, and it has to do probably with Israel. And so that's just some of these ideas that I think we need to take into account. There's something that we can call communication latency that, for instance, in Germany was a phenomenon that came up already with the 60s. And this is nothing new. So I already mentioned it, communication. So we differentiate between explicit and implicit anti-Semitism. I guess explicit anti-Semitism is what most of the quantitative research projects are focusing on. The K-words, slurs, the direct reference to stereotypes. That's pretty easy to find. And implicit anti-Semitism, I would argue, is the biggest challenge. I mean, it depends, of course, on the online milieu you are interested in. But even in fringe communities, you have a lot of subtle tones, not because people are afraid of content moderation, but because of the idea, okay, how can I communicate my point in the most successful way? If I just use some coded speech, some allusions, some, rhetorical questions, I just reach out to my peer group in a way that nobody else understands. So I just cut out the sheeple, the stupid majority society that doesn't get it, that Jews control us. So you have coded speech in different online arenas, and it's very often not taken into account. So implicit anti-Semitism, where you have semantic gaps, where you have innovative speech. I will give you a couple of examples in a second. Where people just don't refer to the anti-Semitic concept word by word. And okay, let me just get to the examples. So these are examples for implicitness, right? And this is just a tiny portion of what we can find. We have a whole system of subtle forms of anti-Semitism that we could find online, offline as well, on signs at demonstrations, etc. And there are, of course, more of those categories. Here are just, 5 or so. And the most simple ones you can see right at the top, right? Semiotic markers, the echoes, and placing Jewish names within it, or icons, the paraglider symbol, the inverted triangle, the watermelon, the soap icon, and we all know what this refers to. It's quite simple. It's quite easy to detect. It's not a big deal to find, to build quantitative tools to get an understanding of how often that occurs. But of course, it's getting more complicated if you go a level further. For instance, when you move to wordplay, where you actually have changes on the surface of the word, still expressing an anti-Semitic idea. I mean, just an example would be the second paragraph, the first line, the reference to Steven Spielberg's movie, where people don't talk about Schindler, but Schwindler, so you have the word swindle. So the idea of Holocaust being a hoax, being a lie, is communicated. And List, with a capital L, refers to the German word that stands for cunning, trickery. So the idea that Jews actually exploit the Holocaust by reminding society of it, is communicated here. So you have actually two anti-Semitic concepts expressed in one slogan. And, this is moving on to allusions where the surface of the word is not changed, but just a word that is quite untypical is moved into a new context. For instance, someone should give George Soros a shower. That's, of course, an allusion to the gas chambers. So here you have an implicit death wish. And it's getting more complicated when you enter the arena of indirect speech acts, like rhetorical questions, that are highly context-depending, and where the problematic content is actually produced by the combination of, in itself, non-problematic words. But just when you have that phrase in terms of an ironical statement or a rhetorical question, you actually, people immediately understand it. Like the first question that you can see here, put below the line of an article about the culture of memory in Germany, everybody immediately understands, okay, this is the idea behind it. This is actually Jews exploiting the Holocaust, just reminding us all the time of it. But find that with quantitative tools, right? This is the challenge I would argue we are confronted with. And so I would argue that when it comes to the detection of anti-Semitism, we need to think of the whole thing as a problem on the horizontal level, where you have a range of stereotypes and analogies and conspiracy myths. But then, of course, you have the vertical level, where you have the same concept expressed implicitly on different levels. And this is just an example for death wish. Just a few examples where you can bring that up. Like another example would be, now we are also getting refugees from Israel after October 7th. Bad timing, I must say. Haven't raw materials become so expensive due to the crisis with Russia? And of course, raw materials refers to gas. So you again have, through a rhetorical question, the reference to the Holocaust, so an implicit death wish. And that's like the different layers you need to take into account in order to get a proper understanding of online discourse. And already yesterday we saw an awesome presentation of my colleague Lev Topor, who was referring to the happy merchant and how often it occurs in various shapes. 9/11, I mean, on a semiotic level, it's pretty easy, I guess, to find, because some of these memes are reproduced over and over again. But of course, when we and it's updated, of course, referring to Ukraine or the pandemic. But of course, there are also, as you saw yesterday, deepfakes that are coming up. We actually have the same like ideas, like mass immigration or the destruction of Western white culture, expressed through the usage of models, like multimodal models, that can produce those images or memes in a sophisticated way. And it's very difficult to find. So I'm just talking about, like I was talking about the verbal level, and now I'm talking about the visual level. I just mentioned deepfakes. There were lots of deepfakes out there after October 7th that, for instance, Netanyahu has been hospitalized, or that there are refugee camps for Israelis. And when you look in detail what's actually presented, you could see, for instance, the Israeli flag is presented in a double way, and it's just not very accurate. But of course, there were lots of deepfakes also reproducing the idea of child murder in a very sophisticated and emotionalizing way. So these things change all the time. You have now the tools to produce that in a very short period of time, and this can have a very profound impact on online discourse and our desire to believe in the stuff we see online, right? So I think this is something. So I would argue, and this is something I'm repeating over and over again, that when it comes to online discourse, we are still in the dark. We are still looking for reliable numbers. We already have a range of research projects that do incredibly important work, but it took a while till the whole thing started. And there are lots of initiatives that mainly look at the whole thing from a only quantitative perspective and just really looking for problematic terms. And they just give you an idea of the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to find. And I would argue that as soon as you hear in a report or wherever you can find it that this is the current scope of anti-Semitism online, 500%, 2,000%, whatever it is, I would be very, very cautious about that. Because these numbers are very often referring to slurs or referring to certain combinations of words that in themselves are explosive. But when you actually do qualitative analysis, you will see that those examples I just presented are the most overt forms. There are many, many different layers of implicitness, and if you analyze mainstream discourse and you just look at 2,000 comments, you will easily find out that 80% of the comments you classified as anti-Semitic are implicit. So this is really a big chunk of the data sets, and this needs to be really taken into account and dealt with, because otherwise, if you just believe those numbers, we do ourselves a disservice. Because it's also like everybody who understands social media and how hate speech works on social media and how complex the phenomenon is, just on a verbal level, just when you think of the huge amount of cross-references in a comment section, how often does a person refer to a previous comment? And you know, okay, there was a reference to George Soros or Netanyahu or whatever like famously Jewish person was named, and only by this kind of anaphora there's a combination with an anti-Semitic trope, but the tools don't get that very often. They don't understand what this cross-reference refers to, because it's like the comment section is just building knowledge on an accumulative basis. Like every comment adds something new, and maybe there's a reference to a previous one or to the post itself, and we very often cannot detect that. So just on the verbal level, it's a big issue, and there's a lot to learn. But I think now with the tools we have, also with Gen AI, things get better. That's probably the silver lining I just want to highlight once again. And that's, of course, more or less the idea of a decoding project, right? So the decoding project started in 2020 with roughly 20 scholars on board, really covering the field like humanities, social sciences, and data science. I had the honor to lead the project. We actually started looking at the topic really from coming from a rather detailed approach, looking at Germany, France, and the UK. And this is the research design where you can see 3 steps, and you can see that the first part is not the quantitative side, which comes really as step 3, but step 1 would be the qualitative analysis of content. That we actually have these 20 people coming from linguistics, image analysis, anti-Semitism studies, history, political science. They look at stuff, online content in mainstream discourse in Germany, France, and the UK, and they go through the downloaded corpora one by one and categorize it according to a scheme that I will just present in a second. And this is then the training material for step 2 in the back, the fine-tuning of classification models, or also prompt-based experiments with Gen AI that we do right now with GPT and Llama, etc. So you get an idea of how anti-Semitism looks like online, and then you build prompts, or you use the annotated material in order to teach those models to do the job for you over time. And then you have the feedback loop, and you get an understanding over time how the work has been done. This is a comprehension question.
Just about this, how many examples do you need to have in order to generate a good AI model?
Oh, this really depends on the complexity of the topic, right? I mean, I will get to this in a second, but it's really depending on how diverse and complex the phenomenon is. I would say for child murder, it wouldn't be that complicated, but when it comes to Jewish power, it's a whole different story. I mean, every concept has its own, prominence in discourse, and also variance of how it is reproduced by web users and also offline speakers. And the step 1 that I just mentioned will look like this. So we use a tool called MaxQDA. On the left side, you see the code system that consists of 160 elements, and it's based on IRA. And on the right side, you see the comment section itself. And we go through the comment section one by one, and the answers or the questions we ask would be always, okay, this comment, is it anti-Semitic? If it's anti-Semitic, second question, what kind of concept can you find? What kind of stereotype, etc.? And the third question would be about the package, the structure, the way of how it is communicated. Because if you know that, you can see how certain ideas become acceptable in your language community. If you look at the idea of child murder in 2020 in Germany, like maybe people refer to that through rhetorical questions, and over time you can see how it becomes normalized because people just refer to it more and more explicitly. And that makes it so relevant to have a fine-grained analysis and understand it over time. And what we did, we had various case studies, 28 case studies. We analyzed 150,000 user comments qualitatively, which was a lot of work, as you can imagine. And the approach was always that we identified a discourse event like October 7th, like, again, Elon Musk or COVID-19. And then we downloaded the data sets that we could find in the context of mainstream media in these 3 countries. And then we worked with those corpora and went through them one by one and tried to figure out what kind of concepts come up and how are they communicated. And then we compared it. And just a quick note about a publication that will be out there in a few weeks, hopefully. I keep boring people about that because it's something that we were talking about already in February. It's just, we had a lot of issues with Palgrave on that issue. It's just something like a guidebook that can be used for by social media researchers, but also by teachers, by influencers, by content moderators that actually need to understand how anti-Semitism looks like online, and how they can draw the line between explicit and implicit anti-Semitism and gray areas. Because since I've been working in the field, these are the questions that come up all the time. And not only about Israel, it's also about, anti-capitalism and George Soros. Is this already anti-Semitic? Is that not some kind of truth value in that statement? Or COVID-19, so much anti-elitism that was out there. But I would argue that in some cases it was not always anti-Semitic. because very often the anti-Semitic object was missing in that statement. There was definitely criticism and hate towards institutions like science and the media, etc. But you couldn't always say for 100% that this is an anti-Semitic, like a structural anti-Semitism, because as soon as you work with AI and you want to use large language models to do the job for you, and you have a large-scale operations, you need to be very conservative about your annotation. Otherwise, you create a lot of false positives. And that's something nobody wants. And so in 2022, I had the idea of doing this lexicon and maybe covering 50 pages so that people can use that. And it became a little bit longer. It's now 550 pages long, which is open access. It's going to be published soon. Again, it's 40 chapters dedicated to an anti-Semitic concept, and it follows the same structure. You have, for instance, the idea of Jewish hypocrisy. You have a historical overview at the beginning, a definition and bullet points that people can use that are accessible and scientifically grounded, and then you have an empirical part. So this is an example, an authentic example for the explicit reproduction of the idea of Jewish lie or deceit. And then you have implicit examples, and what's the difference in between? And then you have a third part about gray areas, where we would say that we don't have sufficient information to classify that accordingly, what I just said. And that's something I really missed. I mean, there are some really interesting, especially in Germany, some interesting corpus linguistic approaches to the topic, and they were extremely inspiring for me. But I missed like a consistent approach, that you can just, you were just looking, people are talking about genocide and the Nazi analogy or the apartheid analogy, and I was just thinking maybe this would actually solve a lot of issues if we have kind of a guideline, 10, 15 pages per concept that people can use, and they can reject it, we can have a discussion, no problem, but at least we try to map it and to build a taxonomy that people can use in a second step. Yeah?
Are you willing to take a question now? Is that okay on this slide?
If it's content related, let's do it afterwards, because otherwise we just lose a lot of time. And, okay, thank you. Okay, so this is like just step one, everything related to the qualitative content analysis, right? And then we, of course, have step two, which is very often the center of interest, and very often when people thought of the Decoding Antisemitism project, they were just talking about the machine learning part, and I understand that this is kind of the really interesting cutting-edge part, but before you can do that, you actually need to have a solid basis in the field of humanities and social sciences, like what I cover as step one. And what we did with step two, on our website, there are 2 reports that you can download that tell you a little bit what we did with the BERT model and with the Gen AI models, and how we work with them, and what kind of score we reached, how good the performance was. And so that might be insightful. And of course, this is a publication that just came out. It's also open access, an edited volume, where the last chapter is dedicated to the usage of AI and how far we could get when it comes to coded antisemitism. Is it really looking promising? What do we need to do as next steps, etc.? I also wrote a piece about Jordan Peterson's interview of Netanyahu. Maybe this is interesting for some of you, so feel free to download it. Okay, so now the topic of October 7th. When October 7th happened, we immediately started doing a lot of annotation work. We focused on YouTube and Facebook. We published this study 2 weeks after the incident. I think it was the first study on October 7th that came out, with regard to social media. And we, as you can see, or maybe not, we analyzed roughly 11,000 user comments in Germany, France, and the UK. And we could see that there's an interesting shift, not only regarding the percentages, that it's really, anti-Semitism is going through the roof. I mean, everybody knows that, and every second research project highlighted that. But it was more or less a change in discourse, in the nature of anti-Semitism. So
There's a line missing on the bottom of the prior slide.
this is just a screenshot. It's, it's just taking.
Can you just tell us what that is?
Oh, it was just celebration, support, and justification that they stood in the foreground. I don't remember what exactly, but if you scan the code, you will come to this website, and you will get the whole. There are various bullet points that are following. I just took a screenshot of it so that you get an idea. So I can also share the reports afterwards. So, And again, you will find all them when you just Google decoding anti-Semitism. You will find all of them. Also, previous reports and previous talks I gave and my colleagues gave. So feel free to have a look. And so, getting back to the nature of anti-Semitism, what I could see in summer 2014 and in May 2021, as soon as there was an escalation phase in the Middle East conflict, that the response online and also offline was an increase in the usage of stereotypes and conspiracy myths and analogies, Israel's the new Nazi state, etc., etc. So that was the clear response from many people under those circumstances. But on October 7th, that changed. These stereotypes went actually down. The frequency went down. And what went up were aggressive speech acts. Like, as I said here, on the previous slide, celebration of violence, the glorification, the justification. So everything that was related to the outlook of the person that was sharing that comment, where there was no justification of that hateful idea through the reference to a concept. For instance, I hate all Jews because Israel is an apartheid state, right? Where you have that kind of justification, justifying argument for people who think that this is the case. And you couldn't even find that. People were just openly saying, I approve what I see. Well, as soon as the first footage came in on YouTube, on Facebook, people were saying, this should happen from now on every day. And that was really the biggest chunk of anti-Semitic statements we could find. And this is something extraordinary. We've never seen that before in our social media studies. And there's some interesting explanation also, like Benny Morris published an article in November, I think, in the Kiyet about the similarities with historical anti-Semitism and the hatred and physical violence and massacres in Eastern Europe. As soon as people in Eastern Europe found out what happened to Jews, they did the same to other Jews. So violence led to more violence. And that's something that is a big difference of like October 7th to previous escalation phases, that Hamas has never been so successful, right? So the sheer confrontation with that kind of violence led to open celebration. And so that was pretty hard to understand. So these are just a couple of examples. Of course, Allahu Akbar was a big central phrase, from the river to the sea, free Palestine, all that. And of course you had forms of glorification like those. A lot of Schadenfreude, a lot of cynicism, a lot of statements where you could see that there's a clear link between hatred against Israelis and hatred against Jews, like in the second paragraph here, right? Austrian painter, it's clear that they refer to Hitler. And something like when you think of a tragedy that was presented in the in this kind of footage and on the photos on YouTube and Facebook and also Instagram, of course, what was really striking was this huge dichotomy between this tragedy that was presented and the jokes you could see, and also the overlaps between misogyny and anti-Semitism. When we think of the female festival goers, like the amount of pornographic, dehumanizing wording I've never seen before. And that led actually to a lot of issues also in the team, and there was also a certain demand for mediation, because before that, in mainstream discourse, this was just not the case. It was very often sophisticated, it was very often very cold anti-Semitism. There was no emotional words, there was no, something that you can see here, and this was just predominant on those days. And of course, people were also demanding for an internationalization of violence. A little bit what we could see also on 9/11, right? This is the clash of civilizations, or whatever you want to call it. And that was also part of every second statement. And combined with those patterns, the two main concepts that came up here and there were the denial of Israel's right to exist and the idea that it's just Israel's fault. So these forms came back. All the other stereotypes, they needed some time. And of course, at a certain point, you had Nazi comparisons to be expected and conspiracy theories that the whole thing is a false flag operation, etc., etc. And this is the verbal level. You have the visual element, of course, the idea of the the paraglider as a visual confirmation and glorification of violence. That here from the profile of Black Lives Matter in Chicago, a lot of deep fakes. You just don't need to say it anymore, right? You can just use those images, and of course, multimodal content, which makes it again so complicated to track it, like the idea of child murder, Nazi comparisons, the control of the US or the control of the public discourse, and in the center, the trivialization of terror. And that's really difficult to find. I mean, it's difficult to process that as a human being, but it's also difficult to find ways of tracking that, not only in real time, but over time, and understand it, like the full dimension of it. And so we just had a project, a small project funded by EPNA in Europe, and we tried to figure out how good classifiers are in order to find anti-Semitic deepfakes. And it didn't look, I mean, there are startups in Israel, for instance, that are able to trace deepfakes, like deepfakes in general, the ones I just showed you at the beginning. But when it comes to anti-Semitic deepfakes, it's much more complicated. And a colleague of mine who is specialized in image analysis, and another colleague from Weizenbaum in Berlin, they worked together, and they could see that the score is not very promising. So this will take some time to understand that. We continued our analysis in the context of celebrating terror with the 6th report that came out in February a few months ago. And we widened the analysis. We were not just focusing on Germany, France, and the UK, but we were also adding 6 other countries, which was kind of something my team didn't really love me for. And so it was a lot of work. And we could see some interesting patterns there too, right? So in Western Europe, in Morocco, Great Britain, France, Germany, again, the glorification of violence stood out. But the more you move to the Eastern Europe, conspiracy theories dominated the discourse. So that was even stronger than the glorification, you could see. And that's what I meant by national discourse, cultural discourse, how important it is to have a proper look at different language communities and how anti-Semitism is brought forward. Because then you get an understanding of what's going on in your society. What are the main pictures, images of Jews in contemporary Morocco or in Austria and in the US. So that was quite interesting. And I mentioned the detailed analysis, just one of the last slides. This is a graph that shows you the results of our qualitative analysis between May 2021 and October 23. May on the left side and October on the right side. And you can see here a whole range of different tropes reactivated, of course, the idea of Israel being the evil of the world, or the soul guilt thing on the lower part stood out, but in general you have a good share of different tropes. And on October 23 you can see quite overtly how much the last category stood out, which stands for the glorification of violence, right? So this never happened before. This was really something unique. This category was activated. I mean, people were just referring to how much they love what they see. And that was something, again, unprecedented. This is just some of our results. What we are going to do in the future, hopefully, is to bring that kind of analysis also to America, to oh my God. That's a good song. I'm sorry. To understand a little bit the transatlantic dynamics, because not only with October 7th, but even also with Elon Musk and Kanye West, you could see how much impact online discourse in America has on Europe. And this is something that is definitely under research. So we want to do this in the future. Of course, we need to work on imagery, also maybe one day audiovisual material, which is very challenging. And our idea for the future would be, since it's also about what do we do with this knowledge, right? It's very interesting insights, but what's the next step? What do we do with discourse analysis and anti-Semitism studies? I think what we could do, and I laid it out in this article I shared at the beginning, is to build tracking tools that get us an understanding on the discourse level. I'm not talking about identity and 1984 and control and whatnot. I'm really talking about how the discourse is changing over time. Because if we have that knowledge, and again, social media are the place where things happen at the moment and in the future. If we have that knowledge, we can build completely different counter strategies. We can do so much more if we understand the ingredients and the narratives and how the discourse is shifting, at what point, what happened in the offline world, which then led to a certain predomination of an anti-Semitic concept, for instance. So this would be really relevant. This could be used in offline contexts, in schools, at universities. This is a little bit what I listed here. So you have social media results, social media study results. You have the offline level where we can do something together with policymakers. We can reach out to influencers, as I did in the last years, content moderators. It's all quite obvious that the knowledge from social media can really improve our responses, and it could pressure social media companies. Because very often, as soon as I was talking to policymakers or people in the political arena, they were always saying the same thing, that they very often don't know how anti-Semitism evolves, how it looks like. They have maybe a couple of reports that are 1 year old or 2 months old, and they are looking at certain online spheres, and that's all nice and cute, but they don't really understand how they should argue in front of those companies. That's very often a missing link. They don't have a proper understanding. And if we have some kind of infrastructure, and I'm really talking about like a bigger thing than the decoding project, obviously, if we have some kind of infrastructure where we can inform those policymakers in the European Union, in DC, so that we strengthen their argumentation, what needs to be done, I think this could have a serious impact on the way how those, I mean, there's definitely some movement on the side of Meta in the last months. Like their decision to take the word Zionist into account was quite impressive, and I think like a step in the right direction, but there's still so much to do. And I think it's very often the exchange between researchers, policymakers, and those companies is very often not really working because everybody is just on their own. It's just not a really like a comprehensive dialogue, an ongoing dialogue, where people actually try to understand each other and see this is really bad for our society. If you leave that on your profile, on your platform, this might have a bad impact not only for Jewish communities, but for the future of democracy in general. And so I think there we could do so much more if we have the right infrastructure and the right funding, etc. And of course, when it comes to online actions, I would say, although knowing that this can really have a bad impact if we engage in counter-speech, because all the consequence of counter-speech is very often that you amplify hate speech, right? That's not what we want. If you see some hateful comment, like some conspiracy myth, and you add your 2 cents to it, that might amplify it, and it's just not good. And but I would say that still, like talking to young people in the last months and also years, or teachers, they very often give me the same impression that they are just kind of lost and trapped in their filter bubble, and they are just hearing all day long that this is what's happening in the Mideast, and there's just no counter-argument. They're just hearing from morning to evening that this is a genocide, that this has been the rebirth of the Third Reich, and there's just no way that we can reach out to these people because they never heard of alternative sources. I mean, alternative sources in a good way. That we actually read some article that was written by one of us, for instance, that they look at the problem from another side. And this cannot be done manually. And when you look at this TikTok study that came out a few months ago, when you look at the proportions between pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, it's completely anachronistic to think that we have a bunch of social media activists and trusted flaggers, and then the whole problem is solved. It's like just a way of interacting with a omnipresent problem whose dimensions we didn't even grasp. And so we need automatic solutions. The precondition for these automatic solutions are models that do a good job, that are reliable in their detection of anti-Semitism. And then, based on that categorization, we can build counter-speech that is tailored that is sophisticated enough, that reaches out to different target groups in a successful way. I know that there are some startups in New York and in Tel Aviv that work on that, but I think they are all missing one thing, which would be a reliable detection mechanism. And that's just crucial. If you just bombard people with messages about something they never said, it's just the wrong signal you send, right? And so this is, I think, something we need to do, and I think we have a good opportunity to do that. At the moment, I'm just missing the right infrastructure that needs to be built by people who are in those positions to do that, and to bring different scholars together, different initiatives together, and to have a consistent approach. And again, I would say everything, the success we could have with this is profoundly depending on the quality of the data sets, on the granular analysis, because otherwise these models will never get what's the difference between that statement and that ironic statement, which is just reproducing the same words, but in that context it just means the opposite. So we need to take some time and do these really tedious training processes, and then we have something that we've never had before, right? That we actually are able to tackle the problem on a much more, on a certain scale that would have never been able to implement in offline communities. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take some questions around. Juliana, you have a question for Dr. Becker?
Do I?
Go ahead.
I have a few questions, if you don't mind.
Martha, do we have a mic?
I'll speak loud.
This one on the back.
This one.
Thank you. Thanks,
Okay. Thank you. So my first question is, how do you communicate, forgive me if I missed this point, but if you've expressed it, but how do you communicate this information, and who has expressed profound interest in terms of law enforcement, politicians, academics, or men and women of the cloth in all religions? And are there teams, I have 4 questions, so this is my first one.
God.
Part A, Part B. Are there teams that you work with that could hold these people who express their comments or statements accountable, like lawyers, law enforcement, and etc.? That's the first question. Do you want me to go on?
Yep.
Okay, the second question is, where do these sentiments come from? Geographically, from which sectors? Are you able to find out which sectors they come from? Academia, politicians, law enforcement? Also, did you do any studies of the communication post-assassinations of people like Soleimani, or the helicopter incident of Rouhani and others? And if you've compared the sentiments between the two? Finally, forgive me everybody, have you also studied any pushback that has come, like online war, right? Somebody expresses anti-Semitic sentiments and then somebody comes and pushes back, whether they're from all religions and individuals.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we have been working with various players in the field, right? I mean, I mentioned the US State Department, we were talking to the police, we were having an exchange with, particularly with Meta. For instance, the implementation of this new step with regard to Zionists. I gave them 5 workshops in the last winter. So I think there might be some correlation because they were very interested in our taxonomy. So there's something coming up there too. This is really nice. I think this is the biggest challenge we are facing, and that we need to improve the discourse, the debate with those platforms. And that we have, and I'm not talking about accountability or playing the blame game. I'm really talking about having a constructive discourse so that people understand, okay, maybe their predefining elements about anti-Semitism are too narrow. It's maybe too much, what we can see in the Stürmer. Maybe it's not the anti-Semitism they are confronted with, they should know about when they entertain such a platform with such an incredible societal impact. So this is happening. I'm also, we are very closely connected to different educational organizations. I've been doing a lot of trainings for influencers, which is, I think, an extremely important aspect because they really can make a difference given that they have such a reach. So for instance, there's the Tel Aviv Institute I've been working with in the last 3 years, and they do regular labs in different cities. And what I've been doing was just offering lots of workshops for them so that they are a little bit more confident about classifying this statement as anti-Semitic, and they can understand the history behind it, etc., etc. So platforms, educational sector for sure. And law enforcement, well, yeah, we had a couple of discussions and presentations in that regard. Again, we were talking also to the police. I'm not really sure how much they implemented because they are, of course, primarily interested in harassment and really overt forms of hatred. I found it quite fruitful what's happening on the legal level. So there are lots of legal scientists who understand that their definition of hate speech is rather limited and that they need to improve it, and they need to integrate also pragmalinguistic forms of like patterns in order to classify it, right? So what does this statement mean in a particular context? Is this already hate speech, or do we just, I mean, there are so many court cases being lost because the legally trained individuals in that context, they were just looking at the word and not what the combination of words mean in that context. And there was just no other potential interpretation of that situation. But they didn't take it into account because their understanding was quite narrow. So on the legal level, there's also something happening. We don't really work with teams that hold those people accountable. So we are really strictly looking at discourse. And to just on the basis of discourse understand what is the what is the dominating understanding of anti-Semitism? Because as soon as we have that, and this is also something we want to do in the future, that first of all we have those classifiers who do a good, reliable job when it comes to the detection, that we add to this discourse level an identity level, which is something you cannot do in Europe for well-known reasons with laws, etc. This is something that is not a good idea, and this is really difficult to achieve. But if we bring that project really, and I hope so that this is still going to happen, to the US, we could bring these two levels together. And then you would be able to understand how mainstreaming of anti-Semitism is happening in different groups, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, I just answered your first question. Let me just briefly go to the second one. So again, the question of where do they come from, these sentiments? If this is something we could reconstruct, there was a certain amount of ideological vocabulary that we could say, okay, this is probably a person that is left-leaning, and then we had a lot of Arabic after October 7th. But in general, it's just, you don't have that information. And we didn't want to click around like on these user profiles and understand and reconstruct where they come from, because what stood out was just looking at the discourse, how it evolves as soon as a discourse event is happening, what's happening in conservative media, what's happening in center-left media, and what's the difference. And that was the main thing, but we will definitely have that on our radar in the future. And Rouhani, etc., this is, at the moment we don't continue our work because we don't have funding anymore. So we couldn't continue the work. We were trying to get in touch with various players, but we haven't been successful so far. Fingers crossed. But as soon as this is the case, we will definitely take new case studies into account. But the October 7th case study was the last one. I mean, at the same time, I'm right now doing a case study about American podcasts and how, for instance, interviews arranged by Joe Rogan and Lex Fridman and Jordan Peterson, etc., how they trigger anti-Semitism from different online milieux, within different online milieux, because the response they get is, of course, much, much bigger than news outlets. So there's a lot of interest for that, in that. And the fourth question was?
Have you also studied any pushback from others, like the online war, people defending the Jews?
Oh yeah, I mean, we could see it. It was always part of the analysis, but I couldn't be able to tell you how this in general works, right? Because again, the precondition would be a certain amount of automation, like automated approaches, so that we can see how the discourse, how the patterns change over time. I mentioned the Tel Aviv Institute. They do some interesting studying right now. They're looking at the way how messaging works and what kind of response they get. As soon as some influencers, for instance, tell another story about Israel or the history of Judaism in Europe, and they not only rely on sentiment analysis, which is great because it wouldn't really help much, I would say, but use different forms of surveys and also fine-grained analysis. So this could be quite interesting what their results are. But at the moment, I can't say much about it.
Yes, let's go to Julio.
Yes.
Please.
I also have a couple questions. So first of all, in terms of, I just wanted to ask, how do you tackle, because I know there've always been these kind of tools to automate the generation and distribution of propaganda, but because of the development in the AI sector, how do you go about tackling such tools which deem it possible for someone to carry out this task with minimal intervention? The second question is, in terms of implicit commenting or anti-Semitism, how do you go about tracking more cultural tropes and ideas which might not be able, as an English speaker, I might not be able to understand, for example, the anti-Semitic tropes or imagery in Chinese, if it's directly translated. Third of all, which social media apps did you use in the training of the AI and tracking of these trends? And lastly, I guess I might have missed this, but I know this is more in the early works. So how do you go about undertaking counter speech against anti-Semitism while balancing that with government regulation, specifically in China and the Arab world?
God, okay. It's also 4 questions. Wow, this is going to be a long Q&A. So the topic about automatically generated content, right? Bots and other tools that are being used. In those online spheres that we were looking at, this was not a major problem. It was definitely, you could see in the way how sophisticated the answers came up, that it was probably a human being on the other side. And even if we were just looking at certain profiles on X, where just the probability is much higher that we were confronted with those tools, we would just take that into account because it has the same effect, right? I mean, I had a conversation recently with someone in New York who said that, Matthias, you need to differentiate between a human web user and some bot farm in Novosibirsk, right? And in general, I would agree. If you have that question, if you want to understand where does it come from, but if you just want to understand what are the patterns that potentially will have an impact on the online community, this is secondary. I mean, at a certain point, we would because it doesn't matter if it's coming from a sophisticated bot or from a human. The effect would be the same if you're just growing up in this kind of group dynamic and you just hear it every day that this is what happens in the Middle East. You would just believe it, right? So the distinction is still not there. All these really sophisticated questions, I think we can only answer if we actually we are successful with the first step, which is actually having reliable tools to do the job, and over time we can improve that. With regard to the cultural tropes, I mean, we had like these 3 country teams. For me, it was really important to have native speakers in each country team because there are, of course, lots of, like the indirect speech acts that I presented here, they were sometimes really difficult to deconstruct by like American colleagues, right? They didn't understand what is actually meant by that. So every language community, every group has their own reference points. Also, the word ghetto can mean different things in different languages, of course, depending on what is predominant in your country's history or your cultural group's history. And so the models would be trained, would be dedicated to one language community, and probably even to a specific online milieu within French, for instance, right? Because you wouldn't be able to use the same model for different contexts. So this is something that we will have to take into account. I mean, this is also what Oren Sur is doing in Beersheba, a data scientist whose work I can really recommend, who's just using a whole bunch of different models in combination in order to track specific forms of anti-Semitism. So really following the different forms of anti-Semitism just in one language and then opening it up towards other languages. So this is something that would be what we would need to do. And of course, as soon as we talk about prompt-based experiments, everything that you do as a person that is doing the annotation, as soon as you work with Gen AI and you lay out the thought process you follow, as soon as you see, okay, this is most probably in this context and the idea of Jewish power, you need to present to the machine actually how you come to this idea, right? You need to lay out the thought process. In that context, you need to present what the characteristics are, why you come to this conclusion, and there you could take that into account. So as soon as it comes to prompt-based experiments, this wouldn't be a big problem, I would say. But again, I'm not a data scientist. I've been learning most of it, like in the context of the project, what are the possibilities and what are the limits. And you could say that depending on if we work with the BERT model that we fine-tuned since 2022 and the usage of prompt-based experiments for GPT 3.5 and 4 and Llama 2, that at the beginning it didn't really look very promising, but over time the score really went up. So this is something we would love as soon as we can continue our work. This is something we would love to do, and I think this has incredible potential in the future. And for counter-speech and government regulations, I mean, we don't really deal with China. This is a whole different topic. But I think as soon as there are certain regulations, I mean, we would have to have a specific approach per country, or the European Union has their own understanding of the problem, and there are certain acts that are in place now. And according to this, our approach would differ from context to context. But again, I think the engagement in counter-speech in this regard is extremely crucial and needs to be done in one way or another over time. But we can talk about this in a little bit more in detail. I see a lot of hands.
Let's go to Wendy, and then we have two, Yael, and up the stairs. Wendy and the two ladies on the stairs, and then we'll come back downstairs. So go ahead, Wendy.
I wanted to jump to your last slide when you talked about offline actions. And the thing is that in the United States, as opposed to other places, there's a division of what the federal government can do versus the states. The federal can deal with commerce, the federal can deal with misleading advertising, but they cannot regulate speech, they can't regulate any of this stuff. It has to be on a state level. So the policy-making considerations have to be considerably different when you're approaching the states. And the same thing with law enforcement, because each one operates kind of separately, and other than track, like the example we saw at the Community Security Trust yesterday, where they tracking things in advance, or they looked at particular ones and looked at a whole account and said, watch out for this guy. That's one thing. But other than that, I don't know what can be done. And so what my mind was thinking is going towards, when you said about increasing pressure on social media companies, it's not just the platforms, you know, Facebook or TikTok or whatever. Perhaps it's also the servers, the companies that provide the services to them.
Yep.
Maybe they have contracts that they sign, and maybe putting pressure on them to have the contractual obligations of those that use their services do something, hit certain measurements of how to exclude. So, and then the other thing that I was thinking of is some sort of certifying organization. Here's a stamp of approval. I won't say a kosher stamp of approval, but the thing is, sites that have earned certain kinds of certification from some kind of agency or organization that's multinational in nature, and it would be something that they'd want to have as some sort of stamp of approval, because it says that they've met certain standards in regulating hate speech or whatever the criteria is. And so to think about how to work together with, I forget the name of the organization, but there's something, there are some international organizations regarding the internet. And maybe that's a way to think about it.
Good point. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think just one idea. As soon as you have this kind of certificate for one website, etc., it doesn't guarantee you that they take care of the problem also in the future. You know, you can't just be lucky or not lucky, really depending on the case, what you examine. And I wouldn't even say that there are bad intentions there. I think, especially talking about news outlets in continental Europe, they just don't have the opportunity, the capacity of dealing with the amount of hatred. And yeah.
But when you think of somebody who's, what is it, ISO certified, whatever it is certified, it does lend something, and you need to apply for recertification. It's just a thought that maybe
Absolutely.
that's the direction to go in.
Yeah,
Peer
yeah.
pressure.
Absolutely, I agree. And I would also add, since we've been talking about the limited capacities of minor players in the field. I mean, not everybody has the potential to tackle hatred like Facebook or Twitter, of course, if I wanted. But like building something like, even something simple like plugins that help content moderators that they can actually, that this is problematic, the reproduction of this or that stereotype would already be of big help for many of those. That's something they very often lack, they don't have.
Great, Yael, and then this young lady, and Wendy. Is there somebody over here that could go next? And then Christoph. Yael, this lady, and Christoph.
Thanks, Matthias. Oh, this might not even be on. I'll just be loud. Thanks, Matthias. I have 37 brief questions.
I knew it.
So I want to get back to the idea about social desirability, because I think we've seen in social psychology what you've seen as well, which is what used to be hard to measure, attitudes, beliefs of anti-Semitic beliefs, used to be hard to measure because they were taboo, and so there was a social desirability bias where people did not want to necessarily admit held beliefs or even recognize, has drastically changed over the last year. There's been and there are those who say, that's great, now we know what we're dealing with. I think what this shows really well, which is what we've seen, which is that when these fringe ideologies or fringe ideas end up becoming mainstreamed through the perception of social norms, and that these perceived social norms that are shaped online, they shift behavior in the real world. And so this behavioral change model we're seeing that is based on the influence of social norms and group influence, which really outpace knowledge. Sorry, everyone who's planning on combating this in the classroom through knowledge. We know that behavioral change is more heavily influenced by these perceived social norms. And so I was really curious through the taxonomy, which are really some of these latent ideas, and obviously you gave us some manifestations of those, but are you seeing certain latent categories that are with which the social desirability is getting mainstreamed faster than others? Are there some that are still kind of more taboo? So for example, I think we've talked quite a lot about anti-Zionism as there's not a lot of taboo around it. It's become the social desirability bias is kind of gone, but so that would be one example of one of your latent categories. Are there others that you have seen a shift post? I guess that's the question. Of my 37 questions, the question is, of the latent categories, which other categories post October 7th have you seen where the social desirability bias is now gone and has really become more mainstreamed in the discourse?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Shall I answer right away?
Yeah.
Okay, so everything, I mean, on the one hand, what I emphasized was, of course, these aggressive speech acts, right, that came out that didn't even change, they were just coming up out of nowhere. So this was definitely something that was quite new. In the context of genocide and the potential that claim has, the Nazi analogy, where actually the Nazi analogy was was far more explicit than ever before. That's something that we noticed. conspiracy theories were still quite coded. The stereotypes, as soon as they came up, since there was a clear tendency towards detour communication, that over time people refer to Zionists instead of Jews, it was quite explicit as well. So in general, I would say that the amount of coded speech went down, but this is just not the way of looking at it over time, because you can see that there's, again, when you look into our 6th report, you can see that in November, the coded forms of hate speech returned. And I think it really depends on what online milieu you are interested in, how grave, how profound the shocking nature of the discourse event was, how this affects the public discourse. I would, like everything that we analyzed so far, it's based on qualitative analysis. I'm always a little bit hesitant of saying that this is the case right now in society, because I don't have the data, but nobody has. Nobody has it, nobody knows it in detail. But again, this would be something that, again, proves my point that we would be able to say so much more about our society and the norms within our society if we use modern cutting-edge technology as well. Thank you.
Thank you,
Here-
Matthias.
here, then Christoph, and then Eddie. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, Matthias, for your brilliant presentation. You said that you are training influencers in social media regarding the use of, Instagram, maybe Twitter and Facebook. My question is the following. From the other side, certain influencers based in Europe, for instance, in Brussels, Belgium, in France, in Germany, are using the same strategy by influencing young people from certain neighborhoods to join the mobilization of demonstrations, pro-Hamas demonstrations in Brussels or in Belgium or in Germany. So how do you counter this narrative? Because these are young people, influencers. They use the Instagram accounts, they use the social media to mobilize young people in certain neighborhoods, and also to call them to boycott Israel, to boycott BDS, Starbucks, whatsoever. And also they say, okay, don't tell me to boycott Facebook and Twitter and Instagram because I'm using these tools to connect with you. So how can we counter this narrative, and how can we report? Because sometimes they are using, of course, as Julio mentioned, in Arabic, for instance, they are using anti-Semitic language, but in a hidden way, as you mentioned in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think it's more or less the same approach I suggested before. I think you need to know what is coming up in that kind of discourse, and as soon as it comes to counter speech and successful counter speech, I'm not really I don't have that expertise how this could be done. What I'm doing is just the analysis of the content in order to understand what has an impact on all of us, on our students, on society. It's like the way how these young people are hijacked, or how society has been hijacked, is in itself also nothing new, right? Like, I can see in a certain tendency that the current climate on campus, on social media, is explained through some kind of orchestration coming from outside, from different rogue states and terror groups, etc. And I think that it has a point. There's something to it. But it would simplify the issue if we just rely on that. It's more to it. And it's also not just the algorithm problem, right? How frictious, negative, hateful ideas are amplified by the way how online communication works. I think there are actually 3 points to it. On the one hand, you have orchestration in some way. You have amplifiers of how they work. But at the same time, coming back to the communication conditions online, at the very beginning, as soon as we had social media, you could see a radicalization in the way how people talk, because they were anonymous, because they had in the cultural memory, there were anti-Semitic tropes. They just needed to be picked up, and they could immediately normalize in such a pace, because there was just no controlling mechanism. And that's something, and I also think that, I mean, until today, I don't get it, why we don't have more studies about conventional media. There are not many conventional, there are, of course, people on social media who say, look at the BBC, look at The Guardian, it's a catastrophe. There are some studies in Germany that do really interesting work, mixed methods approaches to conventional media and how they frame Israel in a certain way. But it's definitely no global phenomenon that people should have done, because this is kind of the ground where all these ideas of like stereotypes and conspiracy myths could just flourish on social media. Because we heard over time, over the decades, from also major media outlets, that Israel is just a military state. They don't show any compassion with the Palestinians. They are just, they are completely brutalized. They don't show any of those positive character traits that we represent in Europe, for instance. And that was a picture that was cultivated over decades. And with regard to The Guardian, there are some interesting studies about that. But it's really a double standard when you look at the way how they look at Israel in comparison to other countries. And that was the starting point from which web users started to actually use anti-Semitic tropes in order to add something to this kind of demonization. And so the way of how this radicalization is, I didn't really answer your question, I guess, but the way of how this works is more or less the same how propaganda works, and we need to be aware of it in order to add something on the level of information, because I think when it comes to bystanders, when it comes to reaching out to different strands in society that are not clearly decided of what to think about the Mideast conflict, I think an information-based approach is not a bad idea. When it comes to people who already tend to have an anti-Israel viewpoint, I think we need to improve our messaging quite a lot. We actually need to build something like empathy. We need to tell stories that are emotionalizing to some extent, just not in order to do some PR, but actually to tell the story that is not out there. I mean, who actually knows what's going on right now in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv? What do people feel with regard to the threat they are facing? And I think this is something that is completely missing. It's definitely in some a part of the online discourse in certain groups, but they are not connected to mainstream discourse. I think we just need to find a way of diversifying it, to amplifying it, to bring it into other communication spheres so the people that are not completely decided, but again, the bystanders, they are our target group, that they can, that they question their own perspective on Israel.
Christoph, and I think, and then Hetty, and if we have time, Dr. Goldsky. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I just have a comment to make as a history professor also. What I find very, very problematic in social media is the gigantic amount of data that was put in there by God knows whom, Hamas-friendly people or God knows what, that counter anything, that I would say. I mean, I'll give you an example. I say something about Gaza and Israel and all that, and Jewish history, etc. A student will pull out immediately the cell phone and come up with alternative data, which I've never heard in my life. Yeah. I mean, like it's disgusting, and you can't discuss anything anymore. And the other day was the question here in the plenum also, what can we do to alter this? And my answer is nothing. Because we confront, let's say, media and stuff that have been falsified, and there's nothing you can do. What do? They just present you with alternative data or other data. So what do you say? Your data are wrong, my data are right. I mean, you cannot win an argument with this, etc. That's my comment. That's only that.
Yeah, taken. And it's also really not very compatible with online discourse, right? When we think of the velocity People don't have time. People just want to have a quick solution, black-white dichotomies. It's just you don't have the time and the possibility to dive into a topic long term. There you actually need offline contexts to deal with the issue. And I think this is something that could be improved. Again, making knowledge more accessible for teachers and professors, and again influencers. I think there's some. I think I'm still quite optimistic about it. And but who knows? Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. If we can make it
Real quick.
Hetty, and then we'll end with Dr.
Okay.
Wilson.
I don't know if this was covered already, but in the university settings, the issue of free speech versus hate speech, it gets really tough sometimes. I can do what I want to do. That's not me as a health professional. So that's A. And B is the slide that you had up of how you are separating out the different categories. I had a little bit of concern because on the left you were talking about anti-Semitism, on the right you were talking about Israel's right to exist, and we've had some conversations here about anti-Zionism being equal to anti-Semitism, and you separated them out. So I'm concerned that people might look at the left and go, okay, yeah, I'm not anti-Semitic because I'm criticizing Israel's right to exist. Was there a reason that you separated them out that way?
Oh, I'm not aware that I did.
Could you?
You mean the slide with the lexicon with the different chapters?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's anti-Zionism. The way we define it, it also includes stereotypes. So it's always part of the overall scheme. Like what you saw in the first block, the ideas of Jewish hypocrisy and lie and deceit and immorality. These categories, these negative character traits are very often projected onto Zionists, onto Israelis. So there's no clear difference. There's just this kind of detour communication. We bring it up in the book. But Israel and anti-Zionism comes up throughout the book because this is the most important reference point when it comes to anti-Semitic statements today.
I understand that, but I'm asking about the slide that you presented with your chapters and how you're titling it.
Yeah.
You are differentiating it in that.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
that done on purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we are the idea about, or the problem about the denial of Israel's right to exist, this is clearly linked. I mean, it's obvious, right? It's clearly linked to the existence of a Jewish state. Whereas all the traits that are the character traits, the different stereotypes and conspiracy myths, they can be connected to Israel, but they don't have to be. So that's why we kept it open. But of course, they can overlap.
Right. I'm just wanted to know, are you ready for people that might say my online stuff is okay? Yeah. It's not anti-Semitic.
Yeah. I mean, this is not the new Bible. It's definitely, we will get a lot of backlash. We will get a lot of criticism, a lot of ideas that won't be compatible, but this is just an attempt.
Okay. In the book, do you define hate speech versus free speech?
Yeah.
The difference?
Yeah.
Okay.
Last question.
So just take what you've done to the next end, which is you must uncover things that are not just anti-Semitic, anti-hate, but threats. Yeah. And I'm curious, the area in which these tools can actually be used to differentiate the speech from the threats, because the best behavioral is the intention for a behavior. And so to what extent, as you're looking at this, do you begin to think about strategies that actually can say also these tools could help prevent hate, prevent actual acts of violence?
Yeah, this is definitely something we have on our radar. This is something we really want to do. At the moment, we can't do it because everything is still really based on manual work, right? The models will get better over time. As soon as you have an accumulation of certain speech acts that, that actually introduce the idea of physical violence or like terror acts even, right? Acts of terror, then the tool I'm thinking of would definitely flag that. But it's what I thought of was, based on discourse analysis and the understanding, the profound understanding of discourse, to have tools that are able to have some kind of early alarm system for that kind of phenomenon, that would be really extremely helpful, because very often it is not based, just think of the whole lone wolves topic. You could not see, coming from offline contexts, that here you have a high probability that this person is going to the next synagogue and commits an act of terror. But you could see that to some extent in the online statements of that person. And that's where I think we actually have an opportunity to use discourse analysis and Gen AI to maybe add something relevant that is still missing. And even when it comes to threats and the articulation of incitement to violence and all that, again, there are also different layers of how you can do that as a human being, and therefore you need a comprehensive understanding of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.